Here to introduce this evening's speaker, who, again, many of you will know. He is Dr. Eric Cambridge, who's an honorary research fellow at the University of Durham. When one thinks of Eric, one tends to think of the early architecture and material culture of the northeast of England. He did his PhD on Durham Priory and its material culture in the later Middle Ages, but of course has published on the early church in County Durham, amongst other things. He is currently studying the friaries, nearly entirely no longer existent, of Newcastle, or perhaps we're going to learn very differently now. Anyway, Eric, shrink that church.
Thank you. I should say that the title I submitted is the title you see on the screen in front of you. That is, Honey, I Shrunk the Church. Someone with very delicate sensibilities about English past participles silently amended it in the programme to Honey, I Shrank the Church. Well, I'm not entirely convinced of the innate superiority of Standard English over other forms of the language, and in any event, of course, it slightly fluffs the illusion. So shrunk I am going to stick with firmly. What I want to do this evening is to look at 3 examples of cases where the design of one church might be construed as a reduced version of a larger prototype, with a view to seeing whether it's possible to infer some of the design processes involved, and also to consider the wider implications for medieval architectural practice. And I start also with a confession, which is that despite promising you the long 12th century, I'm going to start in the late Middle Ages, in the 15th century, but we will get to the long 12th century before long. The reason for doing that is that I think it's probably going to be useful for the first example to relate to buildings which are still all actually there, as opposed to raising problems of being partly ruined or significantly altered in the later Middle Ages. So, do that. I want to do that, I think. So we start with what must be the most notorious church in late medieval Scotland, the chapel of Roslin, just south of Edinburgh. And I say now that I am never going to breathe the word Templars in this lecture. It was built as a dynastic chantry college by a prominent Scottish courtier and designed probably in the mid-1440s. And its eastern arm was built over the next 30 years. The western parts were never completed. So we really only have the eastern limb, which you see here in a photograph I'm very fond of from the 1860s by John Thompson. And the Victorian park railings give you some idea of the very miniature scale of the building. They would have been about head height in their original context. The plan of Roslin is uniquely elaborate among late medieval Scottish, or arguably indeed just about any collegiate churches. It's at the bottom of the middle row of Richard Fawcett's collected series of plans of Scottish medieval colleges. So it's the one lettered with a small M right at the middle of the bottom of the middle row. It had a 5-bay aisled choir and a double aisle at the east end projecting east of a high east gable. So effectively there was a double aisle, an ambulatory on the inner side and a row of chapels on the outer side at the east end. and two arches, as again you see on the plan, divided the main space of the choir from those aisles. The source of the plan is controversial, and I'm not going to tangle with it in detail tonight, but it's often interpreted as, and I quote Richard Fawcett's description here, a much reduced version of the plan of the eastern arm of a much grander church, Glasgow Cathedral, which was begun 2 centuries earlier than Roslin in the late 1230s. Now, if we just accept, for the sake of argument, that there may be a direct relation between these two buildings, what I'm wanting to focus on is what light may be shed on that by looking at their relative sizes. In other words, if Roslin is a reduced version of the choir of Glasgow Cathedral, how much reduced is it? Now, to establish that, you really need to see plans of the two buildings at the same scale. So here is the choir of Glasgow at the top of the slide, and the eastern arm of Roslin underneath. Arguably, the answer is Roslin was reduced from Glasgow by half, and I've deliberately aligned these two plans on the line of the high east gable. In other words, the wall with the two arches between the main vessel and the eastern aisles, so that you can see that. But one immediately has to qualify that statement by pointing out that it only applies to one key dimension, and that is to the internal length of the main vessel of the choir. In other words, Roslin is clearly not a half-size version of Glasgow in all, or indeed any, other respects. Just need a bit of water. And that is immediately obvious. If we reduce all the dimensions of Glasgow by half, which is what I've done there, and you immediately start to see the problems. For example, Glasgow is still at the top on this slide, Roslin at the bottom. If you look at the eastern aisle of Glasgow, housing the side chapels, that's only about 3 meters, 10 feet roughly deep. At its actual size in Glasgow, if you halved it, as you see done here on this plan, so that it was only 1.5 meters or 5 feet deep, and then you reckon that if it's to function as housing subsidiary altars, you've actually physically got to get in the altar and the priest celebrating Mass and probably a server. It would all just become ridiculously tight. So it's not difficult to see why the designer of Roslin might have decided not to run with that dimension. It's just too small for practical use. In fact, if you look down at the bottom, the eastern aisle of Roslin is virtually the same actual size as the full-scale version at Glasgow. And it's interesting that the relative width of the two eastern aisles at Roslin has been reversed from Glasgow, so that the ambulatory is narrow and the chapels are wider, something which makes eminent practical liturgical sense. Likewise, the choir at Glasgow is already pretty narrow for a building of its size and importance. Here you see a view looking east down the choir to the east gable with those twin arches opening into the aisles underneath it, and a cross-section so that you can actually see the scale. The major divisions on the cross-section are at 10-foot intervals. In fact, it's only something like 7.8 meters wide between the arcades, which is pretty narrow for a major cathedral. Compare, for example, Ely or Durham, where the equivalent dimension is more like 10 meters. I mean, they're really quite a bit wider. Now, if you halved 7.8 meters, 25 feet, and you ended up with 7.6 meters, you ended up with 3.8 meters and 12 feet 6 as the width of your choir, which is what it would be if you went for a full 50% reduction on the width. You would again end up with real practical liturgical problems, because even if we were to suppose that there were no front desks in front of the stalls at Roslin, and that may not have been the case by the 15th century, when one would expect professional singing men at a chantry college to have been employed. But even just one set of stalls either side of a main space only 12'6" wide would still reduce the canons of Roslin to kind of eyeballing one another across an incredibly narrow central aisle, which would hardly be wide enough for them both to process up and down to a rest. So again, it just would have gone beyond the bounds of liturgical practicality. In fact, if we go back to the plan of Roslin at the bottom, the choir is actually about a metre wider than half of Glasgow, if you see what I mean. It's an expanded half. And that completely changes the proportions of the central vessel, which are about 1:3 at Roslin here, compared to nearly 1:4 in the equivalent space at Glasgow. It seems to be then that the starting point for the designer of Roslin was reducing the length of the central vessel of the choir of Glasgow by half, but then adapting the other dimensions much more pragmatically. But those adaptations still seem to me to make best sense if they're understood as adjustments predicated on the initial decision to reduce the key dimension, the internal length of the choir, but fully by half. Now, there's a great deal more that could be said about the relations between Roslin and Glasgow and this question of halving and doubling, but I don't want to spend too long on it here, as it's really an hors d'oeuvre from the point of view of the present lecture. So at last we are going to get to the long 12th century. At least we are, if I can get the slide to move. And turn to the Abbey of Arbroath, which is in Angus in eastern Scotland, just a bit northeast of Dundee. Here you see it from the south, and you can see very roughly what's still there now, left to right. There's quite a lot surviving of the west end and the west towers, and of the south transept gable. And the south wall survives pretty well, and the lower parts of the east end, but otherwise there's not a very great deal left now. Arbroath was founded in 1178 by William the Lion, King of Scots, as his burial church, and indeed on his death in 1214 he was buried in the choir at Arbroath, and it was consecrated in 1233. So it was probably designed not long after its foundation, one might guess circa 1180 or very early into the 1180s. And it's common ground that it was strongly influenced by the design of St Andrews Cathedral, its neighbour in Fife, just to the south, which was begun 2 decades earlier in 1162. What you see here in the foreground is largely well, entirely a late medieval rebuilding, but the east gable of St Andrews, right in the distance there, probably is largely work of the early phase begun in the early 1160s. The detailing of Arbroath was updated to a much more obviously early Gothic form, and its size was reduced compared to St Andrews. But how much reduced? Now that question is complicated because St Andrews was shortened at its west end by 2 bays in the later Middle Ages, and a low west porch was constructed on the site of what had originally been the 2 western bays of the nave. And you see that if you compare John McCaffrey's reconstruction with the photograph we've just been looking at. That jamb is the bottom of that window, and the photographer has actually been standing in the area of this large porch. But as originally conceived, the high west gable came right out to the line of this wall, and it was altered in the later Middle Ages. So the relevant figure for our purposes, for a building designed as Arbroath was in the 1180s, within a generation of the starter work of at St Andrews, is of course this outer line, not that line. And if we compare then the internal length of Arbroath with the internal length of St Andrews in its originally intended form, Arbroath appears to be reduced by the square root of 2, a dimension which will not be wholly unfamiliar to any BAA audience, of course. And there you can see plans of the two, St Andrews at the top, Arbroath at the bottom, to the same scale. So the lengths of the two buildings appear to relate in this way, that if we think of the whole internal length of St Andrews, and remember we're working from there, not from there, which is the masonry you were looking at in the photograph, but right out to the original line of the west gable. If you think of that as the diagonal of a square, the internal length of Arbroath corresponds to the side of that same square. That still reduces the length of Arbroath by nearly 30%. So it's not as much as the 50% of Roslin, but it's still a very substantial reduction. Unlike Roslin, reducing the length entails compromises elsewhere in the design. And you can again, if we repeat the exercise that I did before by reducing the plan of St Andrews by the square root of 2, so that you actually see it at the same physical size as Arbroath actually is, and that's what's on the slide now, you can immediately start to see some of the same practical problems that we encountered at Roslin. So in fact, just looking between the two, some features at Arbroath aren't reduced at all. The bay lengths are virtually identical to the bay lengths at St Andrews. And some dimensions, like the nave and aisles, are even slightly bigger than at St Andrews. So looking at St Andrews shrunk down to this size, a root 2 reduction, you can see that you couldn't practically have used the main spans of the arcades at that scale. They would just have been too small. In the choir of St Andrews, as it is, the centre-to-centre spacing of the columns of the choir arcades are 4.72 metres, only 15.5 feet. A root 2 reduction of that takes you down to 3.3 metres, or 11 feet, and that, remember, is the centre-to-centre measurement, not the actual space of the width of the arch, so you'd be getting down to something very small indeed. If the shrinkage raised similar practical problems to those encountered at Roslin, though, there are also very important differences at Arbroath. Most obviously, the chronological one, Roslin was 200 years later than Glasgow. Arbroath was begun only 20 years later than the start of work at St Andrews. How far work had progressed at St Andrews by about 1180 is a very nice question to which I don't really know the answer. But it may not all even have been set out on the ground by 1180. If we look at a plan of it on its own, all the solid black bits are likely to date from the first 20 to 30 years of the work. And as you see, it's not just a question of starting a new church at the East End and working westwards. It's also a question of laying out the plan of an entire new monastery. So a priority for practical purposes was also the lower walls of the south transept and that much of the south aisle wall of the nave in order to provide an abutment for the cloister walks, which is a very common development when you're starting a whole new building complex like that. And that implies, I think, there's a good chance that the designer of Arbroath probably had access to plans of St Andrews. He may, of course, even have been recruited from the works at St Andrews. He might even have been the designer of St Andrews himself, because the two are close enough in time for the same man to have done both buildings. One final point before we move on from these two is this: the use of a ratio to affect the reduction and not a simple fraction as at Glasgow and Roslin in the calculation should occasion no surprise, because ratios, as we all know in this audience, were very commonly used as part of the medieval design process. So it's just a natural extension of something which came naturally to architects anyway in the Middle Ages, I suspect. Well, we're now going to move south, in case you think there's a very distinctly Scottish bias, which actually was rather accidental in the earlier stages of this lecture. And we're finally going to look at two churches even closer in time and in relative size than St Andrews and Arbroath, and that is Ely and Winchester. On the left, you see John Crook's reconstruction, idealized reconstruction of Winchester as published in the pages of our journal some years ago. Idealized in the sense that not everything he shows was actually constructed, but for our purposes it doesn't really matter, because the ground that the plan covers was all constructed, so whether or not individual details were finished off or abandoned isn't for our purposes directly relevant. I couldn't find an equivalent reconstruction of Ely as it would have appeared in the 12th century, rather sadly. But if you look at the light patch of roofing on in the middle of the choir roof there, the location of the Romanesque apse at Ely would have come just to the west of that. So if you ignore all of this end, think away the octagon and think away the upper story of the western tower, pretty much all of that is surviving Romanesque building. The historical links, as is very well known, were close. Abbot Simeon of Ely, under whom the new church was begun, was the brother of the Bishop of Winchester, Walkelin, who began the new cathedral there. Before he came to Ely as abbot, Simeon had been prior of Winchester, and he didn't come on his own. He came with a whole team of sort of heavies, Winchester monks who had obviously been deputed to sort out Ely in a big way, where one suspects that problems to do with its political loyalties in the opposition to the conqueror in the previous generation had cast it under rather a shadow. So he came with a whole phalanx of monks to improve the efficiency of the running of the place, and one might suspect he also came with a team of Winchester masons. Nevertheless, Ely is not a straight copy of Winchester, and never was intended to be a straight copy of Winchester. The eastern arms were planned to be very different from the start. Here you see Winchester at the top and Ely underneath to the same scale. And the differences are most obvious in the plans of the eastern arm. No ambulatory at Ely, no eastern chapel, and of course, no crypt. And Ely is smaller, but as you will have gathered by now, the question that I want to pursue is how much smaller? And the answer in this case appears to be, if you look at the transepts of the two churches, which are directly comparable because they both survive in their Romanesque form comparatively well, the answer appears to be Ely is an eighth smaller, 12.5% smaller than the transept at Winchester. And it's interesting in that regard that the length of the transept at Ely was the only dimension which Eric Fernie found not readily explicable in terms of the unit measure that he identified as ubiquitous in his analysis of Ely. And that anomaly might actually make sense if the measurement was in a sense a given, that is, it was a consequence of the reduction of the plan of the Winchester transept. So it was, as it were, an irrational figure which the designer of Ely then just had to live with. In the light of what we've already seen at Roslin and at Arbroath, might any other dimensions of Ely also have been derived from Winchester? Some, I suspect, for example, the internal width of the nave and aisles arguably were. But the most obvious candidate, if we regard Ely as a shrunk version of Winchester, would be its total internal length, exactly as we've seen in the other two examples already discussed. There, however, the comparison gets complicated because the geometry of the western block at Winchester here, which survives only in at foundation level, is clearly independent of the geometry of the main part of the church. In other words, they're designed separately in geometrical terms. And it's therefore not clear whether it might have been counted in or counted out for the purposes of a reduction, a scale reduction. But excluding that west block at Winchester, in other words, just taking its internal length from there to there, and reducing its main vessel by an eighth, would actually produce a slightly shorter nave at Ely than what was actually built. It would be about a bay shorter, and it would, of course, exclude the whole of the western transept. Is it conceivable that that was the original intention at Ely? Well, two things immediately appear to rule it out. The first is, so far as I can see anyway, there's no discernible building break in the nave of Ely at that point. And the second is that, as Professor Fernie has shown, the design of Ely has built, including its west transept, has an internal geometrical and metrological coherence, which suggests that it was designed to be exactly as it is now from the start. However, there are other considerations which are arguably also relevant here, so it may not be quite as simple as that. The first of them takes us to the originally intended design of Peterborough Abbey. Here we have Ely at the top and Peterborough as originally intended in Eric Fernie's reconstruction at the bottom. The design of Peterborough, its common ground, was really very strongly influenced by the work at Ely, especially because at first Peterborough was clearly intended, or pretty certainly intended, to have transepts of the Ely type with east and western aisles. But its design was changed early on, not, however, before its cloister had been set out to accommodate a western aisle in this position that was never built. And that is why the east walk of the cloister of Peterborough is opposite bay 2 of the nave, not in the normal position, opposite the first bay of the nave. In other words, once they changed their minds, it was already too late to do anything about this bit of vacant space, so they just filled it in as it still functions today, as a kind of vestry, because there was nothing else very sensibly they could adapt it to. The dimensions look very much as though Peterborough was conceived as a same scale, 1-to-1 copy of Ely, though the sizing is not exact. I've aligned these on the inner face of the eastern apses. But what is interesting, if you do that, is that though the transepts don't occur in precisely the same location, because the design of the eastern arm at Peterborough has been elaborated a bit to make it a bit longer, its dimensions result in, if you look from there up, in a slight shortening of the nave at Ely, which is exactly what a 1/8 reduction of Ely from the nave of Winchester would imply. Well, that's not conclusive, but it's a pointer, at any rate, one ought to consider. Peterborough wasn't actually begun until 1118, but the design was probably formulated earlier, perhaps by 1107, perhaps even as early as 1103 to 4. So its design was probably formulated, in essence, even if it was tweaked a bit by the time they actually started work, within 20 to 25 years of the start of work at Ely. So they could still have had access to whatever the initial design of Ely looked like at the beginning of the 12th century. A second bit of circumstantial evidence is that there is, of course, a plausible historical context for wanting to aggrandize the West End of Ely, and that is because, as I'm sure you all know, there was a campaign to turn it into a cathedral, eventually achieved in 1109, but clearly in contemplation from about 1100. So throughout that first decade of the 12th century, there was a lot of agitation going on to get that done, principally because they didn't like as the monks of Ely saw it, the humiliation of their abbot having to seek consecration by the Bishop of Lincoln. So they wanted a bishop of their own to keep him out. The eastern parts of Ely, presumably up to about here, given that the choir would have been in the eastern bays of the nave, were presumably complete by St Ethelthryth's translation in 1106. So it's possible that the design could have been revised before the west end of the nave, right down here, was actually reached. And in that case, the lack of a building break is not an insuperable problem. It could have been factored in by the time they'd built right down to here. And as for the geometrical and metrological coherence of the design as built, I see no reason why any revisions of the design should not have been deliberately integrated into those of the building onto which they were grafted, especially as it was still under construction. So you still actually had access to the original plans to adapt. There are finally, and I confess here to shameless personal prejudice, really, there are also aesthetic considerations. I've always loathed the west transept at Ely. I find it gross and crude compared to the work further east. And it's not just here you see it outside and inside. That's not just because it was later in date than the work further east, but that goes right back to the plan. You see these very thick walls of the, even in the apsidal chapels, let alone the ones that one might have expected to be thicker because they're load-bearing. And that contrasts, to my eye, very markedly with the really rather refined architecture of the parts of Ely that were further east. Here you're looking into the north transept there and down the length of the nave. That does suggest to me that a different architect may have been involved. Obviously, any argument for a change of design at Ely will always be circumstantial, though it is not inconceivable that if you manage to get a trench in the right place, one might actually find archaeological corroboration of it one day. So I don't entirely rule that out. However that may be, and I'm, as you will have gathered, just flying a very large kite here, there are other issues arising from the dimensional relationship between Ely and Winchester, which fall to be considered. The less drastic reduction at Ely meant fewer compromises were needed in other aspects of its design, and particularly in its elevations. And very handily for the work at Ely, and unlike the situation at St Andrews and Arbroath, which we were looking at earlier, the bay widths vary significantly within the design of Winchester Cathedral. Here is John Crook's reconstructed elevation of the south side of the presbytery at Winchester and the east end of the nave. And you can see immediately by eye, just comparing those bays with these bays, that you had quite a lot of options in terms of bay widths to model yourself on. The narrowest were in the presbytery at Winchester. And significantly, perhaps, that's likely to have been the only elevation that had really been worked out in detail by the time the design of Ely was formulated in the early 1080s. It rather looks as though the Winchester Presbytery elevation was adopted full size as the framework for the design of the elevation at Ely. And if we compare to the same scale an elevation of 2 bays of the nave at Ely and 2 bays of the presbytery at Winchester, you can see that, the heights of the individual stages are very different, but the basic scaffolding of it, as it were, the total height and the widths of the bays are actually very close indeed. Incidentally, this, I know, looks like cheating, but it isn't, because the presbytery arcades at Winchester sat on a low stylobate, which is there. So in fact, the comparison line is with floor level there and here. And that produces something very close to the height of Ely as built. Finally, we might ask the question why Ely was designed to be any smaller than Winchester at all. After all, it can't in a way have been very much cheaper to do. Here are the 2 plans to the same scale again. Because if you've got essentially the same number of columns, adding a bit more to the span of your arches and a bit more walling can't actually dramatically have increased the cost. it would be really interesting, in fact, to get a quantity surveyor to look at just what the difference would be. But it seems to me that it's difficult to found an argument on cost alone. There may, of course, have been site-specific constraints at Ely, which we're completely unaware of now, though one does wonder, given how much extended the early Gothic presbytery of Ely actually was, whether there can have been any significant constraints. But another possibility which we ought to consider might be a non-architectural one, and that is that Winchester was William the Conqueror's great prestige project of his later years. And so it was possibly actually tactful not to rival it directly, at least in his lifetime. Even at 7/8 of Winchester, and even if you accept the possibility that, as first conceived, the west transept at Ely ought to be excluded, it would still have been one of the largest churches in England of its day at the time it was designed, because remember, something designed in the early 1080s falls just before the whole series of really huge designs which happen in Anglo-Norman England at the very end of the 11th century. Well, the search for dimensional relationships in the formation of a design, as opposed to, say, stylistic relationships, I suggest may have a role to play in explaining why some churches took the form that they actually did. It may offer us insights also into the design process, particularly in implying the availability not just of plans, but of the sort of plans that were good enough to scale down from. What they looked like, of course, is another matter. If we look here at Viard Donnacroix's sketchbook, they might have looked a lot more like this one than they looked like his plan of Cambrai Cathedral here, which looks very much more like what we would today recognize as the standard conventions of a plan. And I'd just flag up, for those who remember, that it's not so long ago that Dr. Kinsler lectured us, making from a completely different perspective a rather similar point, that actually we shouldn't assume just because we don't have any plans surviving from that early that they weren't in existence. Dimensional relationships, of course, between buildings are hardly news. They're very well attested in cases where there was a strong iconographical incentive to adopt them. For example, there is the whole series of very large English buildings of the late 11th and early 12th centuries where it has been convincingly argued they really were trying to match one to one the length of Old St. Peter's in Rome. And as Peter Kidson pointed out many years ago, it can't be coincidental that the architect of Hagia Sophia made the diameter of its dome a reduction by the square root of 2 of the dome of the Pantheon. But one can see very clearly in contexts like that why there is a strong iconographical motive to build in the relationship. But the examples I've been looking at here seem to me to imply that the practice was rather wider than in such special cases. In other words, obviously all the major buildings I've been looking at are rather grand and impressive buildings, but there isn't a specific iconographic reason why, say, Arbroath should have been like St Andrews or Ely should have been like Winchester. So why did they do it at all? Was it important for architects to, as it were, build in an acknowledgement of the work of their predecessors, however arcanely, and it would have taken some unraveling to work out some of these relationships? They're certainly not apparent just by eye. But in any event, I hope I've managed to convince you that looking at the dimensions as well as other aspects of the design are a factor worth considering. As actresses have been assuring bishops for generations, size matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. I'm still smirking at your last comment, sorry. Yes, from the floor, do we have questions? Complete silence in the room. I had one and I've forgotten what it is already. I guess, yes, it was about you with St Andrews and Arbroath speculated that the master may have been the same person, as I recall.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that then raises the question of how many people one imagines were capable of working out how to plan a great church.
I think
and that therefore, well, okay, carry on.
No, I think you're exactly right. It does raise the possibility that the situation we know obtained in the later Middle Ages with, widespread consultancies, as I suppose we'd call it now, might have been the case earlier too. And again, it's just because we don't actually have the positive evidence, independent evidence, in the way that we do for the later Middle Ages. But I think you're right, that is certainly something one ought to consider, whether people who were really operating at this level were fewer than we might think.
You wouldn't want to entrust some random stranger with the task of constructing Ely, shall we say, which, let's face it, is vast and hugely expensive.
That's right. And also, if you think about it, at a practical level, item 1 on the agenda in the meeting between Father Abbot or the bishop and his mason must have been, master mason to bishop, okay, Father, how big do you want it? And the answer he was very unlikely to get was 272'6", please. He might have got as big as X or bigger than Y or not as big as Z, but in a sense, Masons had to both wrestle with the practicalities and also deal with clients who were not very likely themselves to be expert enough to deal with the precise details of how they calculated these things out.
An eighth is a very strange reduction.
Now, it's very interesting you say that. I cut a section because I just thought it wasn't going to fit in terms of time, which discussed the question as to whether an eighth is dealing with a fraction or it's in fact the result of manipulating ratios. And there is a possibility that it is the result of manipulating ratios, because if you subtract the ratio of the square root of 2, 1 to 1.4142, from the ratio of the golden section, 1 to 1.618, you get near as, damn it, an eighth. It's not quite an eighth, but it's so close that I don't think you would ever be able to tell the difference inductively by looking at a building on the ground between those two approaches of dividing by 8 and multiplying by 7, or between manipulating those two ratios. And after all, when you think about it, it sounds very abstruse put like that in the abstract. But if you think about it in drawing board terms, all you're really doing is putting your longer golden section rectangle on the drawing board, slotting a root 2 rectangle inside it, and taking off the strip at the top between the two lengths. So it's perfectly possible that, in fact, it was arrived at in the same way as the Arbroath root 2 reduction was.
Which would be done, as you say, on a plan rather than by looking at some lines generated by waving sticks on bits of rope in the ground, one would
I
suspect.
I suspect that's right, that it just makes more practical sense to do it in, well, you know, I'm not saying they weren't using a tracing floor, but they could have been doing it like that, or even on parchment at an early stage.
Does anyone want to interrupt this conversation that Eric and I are having? Yes. I'm going to race to the back.
Hi, thank you. That was a really exciting paper and a lot to think about. I had a question about your last kind of thoughts about possible iconographic significance. And I was wondering, when you have like Ely as a copy of Winchester, would it have been recognized as a copy, especially when they changed the design of the East End as much as they did? And after they've kind of like adjusted all of the dimensions to fit the initial reduction, would it, and it, you know, all the ratios don't match anymore, would it still have been seen as a copy? And would the kind of like significance and sort of symbolic meaning of Winchester have carried over to Ely when it's no longer an exact copy anymore? Sorry, it's a bit rambling.
No,
Did that
I
make
see
sense?
exactly where you're coming from. And I think it is actually a very profound question, which is why I was musing at the very end of the lecture as to whether actually a lot of this stuff was really very arcane and wouldn't have been, you know, widely perceived, and yet somehow mattered to the people who were actually doing the designing. I think it's a very interesting question as to whether, as it were, a casual observer, say, you know, the Bishop of Winchester visiting his brother for the weekend, would actually have perceived the two as being as closely related as in fact they are.
The Bishop of Winchester would have admired the Bishop of Ely's fancy peers. Actually, perhaps they come a bit later, but anyway. There are so many ways in which Ely is better than Winchester, Eric, and you know it. Sorry, Ely is better than Winchester. I did say that, didn't I? Yes.
No, I agree. I think Ely is fantastic.
Here is a man who will disagree. Dr. Jem.
I won't disagree at all. No. One of the interesting things about how you perceive Winchester, Ely, is however abstruse some of these points about the planning may have been, what you perceive is the actual aesthetic effect of the building when you visit it. And that was what is going to be most apparent to people. And at Ely, you can see that the masons, the master mason, were working out the design in the transept. You can see different stages of them establishing a design, which they then apply to the nave, and they produce the most sublime example of English Romanesque architecture in the process. And ultimately, that is what counted to most people who would have been visiting the building.
I think that's absolutely right. But would you see, Richard, equally a contrast between what seems to me to be a real aesthetic high in the mature version of the design in the nave at Ely and the work in the Western transept, which seems to me a most catastrophic aesthetic anticlimax? Yeah. Also, if I can do a bit of proactive questioning, as we've got Lisa Riley in the audience by fortunate chance, had you had any thoughts, Lisa, about the relationship to Ely, you know, in the early stages of the design at Peterborough?
Well, I haven't thought about it in quite a long time, that's for sure. Since I wrote that in
I didn't mean to drop it on you.
1990. I didn't really think about it in those terms about the way you've looked at it with the plan as a reduction. Certainly there are similarities in elevation. As you know, I think the date is earlier and also related to things that are going on in Kent as well, because of the prior and the Abbott situation. But they certainly are very similar, and they certainly both are also being taken over by someone from outside because of the political situation, because the monks flee Peterborough. So
Yeah.
I think that what you're sketching out makes sense in terms of what's going on at both buildings at the same time.
Yeah, I think Peterborough monks got into even hotter water than their counterparts at Ely.
They got into very hot water, and they all run away and then are brought back. So although I didn't think about it in the way you're thinking, I can see how that worked because there are a lot of connections.
Yeah, I mean, the other point to make, perhaps I should have said this in the lecture actually, is that, of course, perceptions of size were changing so rapidly in this period that as between the early 1080s, when Ely was designed and would have been one of the largest churches in the country, even at 7/8 of Winchester, and when Peterborough was eventually begun in 1118, a church the same size as Ely of only a generation before does look actually rather modest by the second decade of the 12th century, because in the interval, all these really colossal Norwiches and Durhams and Bury St Edmunds had happened, and that must have changed perceptions very, very quickly.
Although, at the same time, like you could see in the plan, the Anglo-Saxon church foundations, it's 1,000 times the size of the previous.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I think in terms of people's immediate experience, how many people are going to see these other huge churches, it certainly looks enormous compared to what they're used to and to what's been there before.
Yeah, yes, I think that's right. I mean, nobody would ever have thought Peterborough was small,
No.
even in its first iteration.
Not at all. It's quite a dramatic shift.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I'd say.
Thanks.
Any more for any more? Sorry? Oh, I better check. There rarely are. Sorry about this. I'm just...
No, it's all right.
Oh, hello. Frank Woodman on the interweb asks, should we throw Bury into the Ely-Peterborough mix, especially at the West Ends? And then there's Old St Paul's.
Yes.
Thanks for that, Frank.
Yes, well, he's absolutely right. But of course, in both cases, the question is complicated by the fact that the designs expanded in the course of construction, didn't they? Old St Paul's 1 and Bury 1, if one can put it like that, were clearly nothing like as big as both buildings ended up being. Is that fair, Richard? I think both have clearly expanded quite considerably in the course of construction, as starting large but ending up huge, is to put it very crudely. And that is all part of this very end of the 11th century expansionist outlook.
So you'll be back next year with Honey, I Grew the Church. And with that thought, I think it's time to draw proceedings to the close. A number of us will be going to the pub. If you want to join us, we'll assemble in the lobby and then be squished up in a local pub. But otherwise, let us thank once again Eric Cambridge.